The public discourse is saturated with the theatrics of hypersonic missiles. This is a deliberate misdirection. The protocol for 21st century state-level decapitation is not a launch sequence. It is a signal of absolute silence. While you are conditioned to look at the sky, the primary vector of attack is subterranean and orbital. The operating doctrine is no longer speculative. The Small Wars Journal's analysis of drone warfare in Ukraine provides the blueprint. Low-cost, asymmetric assets achieving disproportionate systemic damage. This is not a kinetic cost problem. It is a leverage calculation. An adversary will not engage in a symmetric exchange when a strategically placed, low-signature attack on critical infrastructure can achieve paralysis. This protocol is triggered by perceived insolvency. A hawkish pivot from the Federal Reserve, as documented by the Chronicle Journal, is not a sign of strength. It is a signal of a systemic solvency crisis. Simultaneously, internal intelligence from analysts like Larry Klayman warns of escalating domestic fracturing, predicting a Marxist-style Bolshevik revolution that forces the state to divert security assets inward. This creates the window of opportunity. The result is the blind Leviathan, a conventional superpower whose digital nervous system has been severed. No financial data, no satellite intelligence, no secure communications. With the Taiwan Strait crisis escalating as a key regional challenge, the state is forced into a zero-sum choice: accept the paralysis and subsequent systemic decay, or initiate a launch-on-warning protocol, a kinetic escalation born not of strategy, but of blindness. This is the mathematical vector to global conflict. A state does not launch a war when it is strong. It launches a war when its balance sheet is collapsing. The motive is not conquest, it is solvency. An unpopular conflict becomes a necessary financial instrument to manage catastrophic domestic liability. Analysis from strategic institutes like RUSI frames the Ukraine conflict not as a geopolitical gambit, but as a solvency crisis. When a regime can no longer pay its bills or placate its population, it must export the crisis. The war becomes a systemic release valve for internal pressures that have no other outlet. This is the pivot to asymmetry. A power facing economic insolvency cannot afford a conventional, high-cost kinetic engagement. It is forced to adopt low-cost, high-damage protocols. The Small Wars Journal documents this doctrine in detail. The mass deployment of drones in Ukraine is a direct function of a depleted treasury. It is the blueprint for achieving strategic objectives without the required liquidity for traditional warfare. This mechanism is universal. It applies to state-level actors in the Taiwan Strait and to non-state actors facing systemic pressure. Reports from analysts like Larry Klayman cite escalating domestic violence as a parallel asymmetric response when established orders are set back on their heels legally. It is the same protocol on a different scale. When conventional power recedes, asymmetric force is applied as a corrective. This creates a predictable vector. The declining power, crippled by debt and internal fracturing, is goaded by low-cost attacks it cannot absorb indefinitely. Its only remaining lever is conventional escalation. The solvency crisis does not lead to managed decline. It mathematically guarantees a launch-on-warning posture, creating a zero-sum path to systemic conflict. The central mechanism is the economics of lethality. According to analysis from institutions like RUSI, the kinetic cost-benefit ratio has inverted. A $5 million main battle tank can be operationally neutralized by a $500 FPV drone. This is not a balanced exchange. It is a systemic financial drain. This reality enables a protocol we call the democratization of violence. The monopoly on high-impact force, once held exclusively by solvent nation-states, has been fractured. Lethal capability is now accessible at a cost low enough for non-state actors or less developed adversaries to leverage. For a conventional power already facing a domestic solvency crisis, this creates a mathematical certainty of defeat through attrition. Every engagement becomes a net negative financial transaction. This forces the zero-sum choice. Accept being bled dry by 1,000 low-cost cuts, or escalate to a conflict spectrum where the high-cost assets can theoretically still dominate. The protocol of asymmetric escalation does not manifest in a vacuum. It requires a staging ground, a gray zone where the kinetic cost is low for the aggressor, but the systemic cost is high for the target. CSIS analysts identify these zones as proxy laboratories, where low-cost, high-damage attack vectors are tested and refined before deployment against the primary target. Regional instability, from warnings in South Africa to domestic fracturing in Canada, are not the cause. They are symptoms of a system being probed for weaknesses. The Ukrainian conflict serves as the premier laboratory. According to the Small Wars Journal, it provides a direct window onto the Red Army's doctrinal concepts. This is not a war for territory. It is a live-fire calibration of asymmetric hardware. FPV drones, costing hundreds of dollars, are being used to neutralize multi-million-dollar assets, generating a blueprint for attritional warfare that is economically unsustainable for any conventional power to counter. Simultaneously, the Taiwan Strait is leveraged as a second gray zone. As reports in Deshkal News confirm, the regional challenge is engineered to test U.S. naval response and political resolve. Each sortie and naval drill is not a prelude to invasion, but a strategic stress test. The objective is to force a constant state of high alert, draining resources and creating a solvency crisis in military readiness, making the declining power security guarantees a measurable liability. The final and most critical gray zone is domestic. Internal fracturing provides the most efficient attack vector. It requires zero kinetic deployment by the adversary. Reports from USAWatchdog.com detail warnings from attorney Larry Klayman of escalating violence, predicting a Marxist-style Bolshevik revolution to destabilize America. With DHS officials like Kristi Noem allegedly being targeted, the internal political landscape becomes an asymmetric battlefield, where perceived weakness is an open invitation for externally amplified chaos. These gray zones are activated by a single accelerant: economic decay. A Fed independence crisis, as noted by the Chronicle Journal, or any hawkish pivot that triggers domestic insolvency, acts as the launch signal. This systemic financial weakness is the blood in the water. It telegraphs an inability to sustain both domestic stability and foreign commitments, forcing the zero-sum choice between accepting systemic decay or escalating kinetically. The math does not lie. Therefore, understand that these are not disparate crises. They are a coordinated, multi-domain rehearsal. The drone tactics perfected in Ukraine are the blueprint for disabling infrastructure. The naval pressure tested in the Taiwan Strait is the model for enforcing a blockade. Each gray zone is a laboratory for developing a specific protocol of attack, designed to be executed when the target's economic and social solvency reaches a predetermined breaking point. The central nuclear liability is not the warhead, it is the data stream. The doctrine is launch on warning. This is not launch on impact. The protocol, as outlined by strategic bodies like RUSI, dictates a full kinetic response the moment early warning systems detect an enemy launch. This is a mathematical calculation to prevent your own arsenal from being eliminated in a first strike. It is a use-it-or-lose-it imperative hardwired into the command structure. The vector for asymmetric attack, therefore, is not the silo, but the sensor. Adversaries understand this protocol. Instead of a costly kinetic strike, a low-cost cyber or electronic warfare attack can blind the radar and satellite network. This induces the fog of digital war. The commander in the bunker is presented with screens that are either black or, worse, injected with false positives. This forces the commander into a zero-sum decision matrix. Is the signal loss a simple malfunction, Or is it the opening phase of a decapitation strike with hypersonic assets already inbound? To wait for confirmation is to risk the annihilation of your retaliatory force. To launch is to initiate global conflict based on potentially corrupted data. This manufactured uncertainty is the ultimate form of leverage. This scenario becomes the probable vector when the target nation is perceived as operationally compromised. As domestic fracturing accelerates, with internal reports warning of increasing violence, source number 4, and a systemic solvency crisis looms, source number 3, the command authority is seen as distracted and weak. This invites a low-cost, high-damage probe in a contested zone like the Taiwan Strait, source number 2, using the exact electronic warfare doctrines observed in arenas like Ukraine, source number 1. The trap is triggered, forcing the choice between accepting decay or initiating kinetic escalation. The protocol of asymmetric escalation is triggered by two inputs: a solvency crisis and domestic fracturing. Reports on the Federal Reserve's hawkish pivot signal an internal economic war footing. Simultaneously, figures like Larry Klayman forecast that domestic political friction is vectoring towards violence. To an adversary, this reads as a systemic liability, an open invitation. Adversary doctrine, refined in theaters like Ukraine and documented by the Small Wars Journal, has perfected the low-cost, high-damage attack model. The primary theaters of tension, such as the Taiwan Strait, are not just flashpoints but laboratories for these methods. The objective is not to win a conventional war, but to make the cost of maintaining the current system unbearable for the declining power. Therefore, the calibration shot will not be kinetic. It will be logistical and deniable. Within 11 months, anticipate a cascading, non-attributable shutdown of the crane and terminal operating systems at a primary U.S. deepwater port, likely Long Beach or Seattle-Tacoma. Not a power outage, but a logic-based failure-freezing cargo movement for 72 to 96 hours. The event will be classified as a catastrophic software flaw. There will be no state actor to blame, only immense economic damage and a clear signal sent. It is a precise test of the American capacity to absorb a systemic shock while politically paralyzed. The response, or lack thereof, will determine the timeline for the next phase.